What exactly is the eligibility criteria for a divorce? In Singapore, the only legal ground that's accepted for divorce is the irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. The Women's Charter outlines 4 scenarios or facts which can be used to prove this. When considering divorce in Singapore, it's important to grasp the eligibility criteria, the sole ground for divorce, and how to prove it. What exactly is the eligibility criteria for a divorce? Number 1, domicile or residency. This means at least one party must treat Singapore as their permanent home or domicile when filing or have habitually resided in Singapore for 3 years before starting divorce proceedings. Number 2, waiting period. This means you cannot file for divorce within the first 3 years of your marriage. Exceptions sometimes exist if you can demonstrate exceptional hardship or depravity. For example, suppose your spouse has caused significant financial hardships through reckless spending or abandoned the family shortly after marriage. In such cases, you might be eligible to file for divorce before the 3-year mark. Next, let's talk about the grounds for divorce, namely the irretrievable marriage breakdown. In Singapore, the only legal ground that's accepted for divorce is the irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. The Women's Charter outlines 4 scenarios or facts which can be used to prove this. Number 1, adultery. Number 2, unreasonable behavior. Number 3, desertion. Number 4, separation of 3 years with consent or 4 years without consent. It's important to understand that for the court to grant a divorce, at least one of these factors must be present and proven. Let's take a closer look at each one of them. Number 1, adultery. To prove adultery, you must demonstrate that your spouse engaged in extramarital sexual relations or provide evidence suggesting it likely occurred. For example, evidence must include hotel stays, intimate photographs, or messages indicating an affair. Hiring a private investigator could sometimes also be necessary to gather this evidence. You must file for divorce within 6 months of discovering the adultery. Continuing to live with your spouse for over 6 months after finding out about the adultery invalidates this ground. Number 2, unreasonable behavior. Unreasonable behavior refers to conduct by your spouse that makes it unreasonable for you to continue living together. This is a more subjective ground compared to adultery. For example, unreasonable behavior can include domestic violence, verbal abuse, substance abuse, financial irresponsibility, or emotional neglect. The court assesses whether it is intolerable for one spouse to live with the other, considering both spouses' attitudes, character, and behavior. Number 3, desertion. Desertion occurs when one spouse continuously abandons the other against their wishes for at least 2 years before filing for divorce. 2 years needs to be uninterrupted. For example, if your spouse left for a brief period and returned but continued to desert, the clock doesn't really reset. Total desertion must add up to 2 years with no more than 6 months spent together. Proving desertion also requires showing that your spouse intended to permanently leave the marriage through non-consensual separation. Number 4, separation of 3 years with consent. This is a valid ground if you and your spouse have lived separately for 3 years and both of you consent to a divorce. For example, this ground is often used in amicable, uncontested divorces where both parties agree to end the marriage. Separation of 4 years without consent. Similar to the 3 years separation situation, consent from your spouse is not required if you've lived apart for 4 years. Remember that for each of these grounds, the court evaluates whether the marriage has irretrievably broken down. The court cannot grant a divorce if none of these factors are actually present. In summary, understanding the eligibility criteria and the sole ground for divorce in Singapore is extremely important. Whether it's proving adultery, unreasonable behavior, desertion, or demonstrate separation with or without consent, each scenario requires careful consideration and evidence. Seeking professional legal advice is therefore advisable to navigate and understand the process effectively. So, now you know. If you found this helpful, follow and subscribe to our channel for more legal things.